The moment I realized work had become my identity did not happen in a boardroom or during some dramatic argument at home. It happened in Frank's backyard on a warm evening when nothing important was supposed to happen. Frank, a retired neighbor, had invited a few people over, and Margaret, my wife, had convinced me to go because she said I needed to be around people who did not know me by my job title. There were folding chairs in the grass, a table covered with paper plates, and a slow conversation moving from weather to grandkids to home repairs. I remember standing near the fence with a plastic cup in my hand, already checking the time in my head because I had an early call the next morning. Frank asked what I did, and I gave the answer I had given for decades. I told him the title, the company, the size of the group I managed, and the kind of problems that came through my office. I did not mean to sound rehearsed, but I could hear the old rhythm in my voice, the professional version of me stepping forward before the rest of me had a chance. Frank listened politely, then asked what I liked to do when I was not working. That question should have been easy. Instead, I stood there smiling like a man who had misplaced something important and did not want anyone to notice. I could have said I liked walking after dinner or fixing things in the garage or reading in the morning before the house woke up. Those answers were not lies exactly, but they felt like old labels on empty drawers. My first instinct was to mention something useful, something organized, something that still sounded like discipline. I almost told him about a committee I sat on. I almost mentioned a course I had taken for work. Even when someone asked about pleasure, I reached for evidence that I was productive. On the drive home, Margaret asked why I had gone quiet. I told her about the question and tried to make it sound harmless, but she heard the part I was avoiding. She kept her eyes on the road and said maybe it bothered me because it should have been simple. That sentence stayed with me. At home, I stood in the hallway and looked at my work bag by the closet. It was just a black bag with a worn handle, but that night it looked like a symbol of everything I had allowed to define me. For years, I had carried it like proof that I mattered. Now it looked like something that had been carrying me. I thought about how often I introduced myself through work because it was safe. A title made people nod. A title explained my tiredness, my distracted evenings, and my careful seriousness. It gave me a clean shape in the world, but a title can also become a hiding place if a man lets it. That night I did not solve anything, and I did not suddenly become wise. I simply saw the first honest outline of the problem. Work had not only taken my time, it had become the easiest answer to who I was, and I had repeated that answer for so long that I no longer knew what remained behind it. What stayed with me most from that evening was not embarrassment exactly. It was the strange feeling of being caught without my uniform while still dressed. I had spent so many years learning how to sound capable that I no longer trusted any answer that did not prove capability. The other people in Frank's yard seemed to have ordinary pieces of themselves available. Gardens, fishing, books, grandchildren, old cars, church breakfasts, little routines that were not designed to impress anyone. I had routines too, but most of them were built around recovering from work or preparing to return to it. That difference bothered me. Later that night, after Margaret went upstairs, I sat at the kitchen table for a while and tried to make a private list of things I liked. The list looked childish and uncertain. Coffee before sunrise, the smell of sawdust. Quiet walks. Watching Evan ask serious questions about simple things. None of it sounded like the man I introduced at parties. That was the problem. The true answers felt too small because I had spent decades feeding the impressive answer. I had not lost myself all at once. I had starved the quieter parts slowly, then acted surprised when they could barely speak. Before going to bed, I wrote one more sentence under the list and then crossed it out. It said, "I am tired of being only useful." I crossed it out, but the mark did not erase the truth. It was the first honest sentence I had written about myself in a long time. The next morning, I arrived at the office early, partly because it was my habit, and partly because I did not know what else to do with the discomfort from the night before. The building was quiet when I came in. The lobby lights were on, the elevator carried me up alone, and the floor had that stillness offices have before everyone begins turning concern into urgency. I used to love that hour because it made me feel ahead of the day. I would set my coffee on the desk, open the laptop, and feel useful before most people had even found their keys. That morning felt different. Before I sat down, I looked at the framed awards on the wall outside my office. They were department awards, not mine alone, but I knew the seasons behind them. I knew the late calls, the tense meetings, the weekends that became workdays, and the dinners where I told Margaret I was almost done. The awards were clean and polished behind glass. The cost had never been displayed next to them. When the computer woke up, the old rhythm returned quickly. One email needed a decision, another asked for approval, and another requested that I step into a project that had drifted off course. I answered automatically. Read, decide, reply, schedule, move on. Within a few minutes, the pressure came back, and to my surprise, I felt relieved. That disturbed me more than the question in Frank's backyard. The pressure gave me shape. It told me where to put my attention. It allowed me to stop wondering who I was, because inside that pressure, I had a role. Sam, a younger co-worker, stopped by later that morning with a notebook in his hand. He asked how I stayed so calm when things went wrong. I had been asked that many times, and I usually gave a clean answer about experience and patience. This time I looked at him and saw a younger version of myself, eager to be trusted and afraid of looking ordinary. I told him to be careful what he trained himself to tolerate. He nodded like he understood, but I knew he probably did not. I would not have understood it at his age either. After he left, I sat for a while with my hands on the desk. I thought about all the compliments that had slowly boxed me in. People called me steady, dependable, essential, and calm under pressure. Those words had sounded like respect, and some of them were, but they had also taught people to bring me more weight, and they had taught me to accept it without asking whether I was becoming smaller outside the office. Late that afternoon, Richard, my manager, asked if I could stay for a regional call. There was no crisis, only another conversation that could have waited. I felt the old yes rising before he finished asking. Then I felt something else underneath it, a fear that if I protected one ordinary evening, I might become less necessary. That fear told me the truth. I was not staying late because the call mattered. I was staying because I did not know who I would be if people stopped needing me. I still said yes that day, but I heard the answer differently. It sounded less like commitment and more like surrender. That day, I began noticing how many systems at work rewarded the version of me that was easiest to overuse. If a meeting became tense, people looked toward me. If two departments disagreed, someone asked me to translate the disagreement into a plan. If a deadline slipped, my name appeared on the message thread because I had a history of cleaning up what others left tangled. None of that was evil. In many ways, it was how careers are built. The problem was that every reward came with an invitation to disappear a little further into usefulness. During lunch, I sat alone in my office with a sandwich I barely tasted and looked at my calendar for the next 2 weeks. Nearly every open space had already been claimed by someone else's urgency. I remembered Margaret once asking whether there was a week in the future when things would slow down, and I had told her probably after the quarter closed. That answer had become a family joke because the quarter never really closed. It only changed names. Looking at the calendar, I understood that I had been waiting for work to release me from a life I had helped design. The call that night lasted 40 minutes and produced almost nothing. When I got home, Margaret had already gone upstairs. The kitchen light was still on over the sink, and my dinner was covered in foil. I stood there looking at that plate and understood that the meeting had not taken my evening by force. I had handed it over. Once I recognized the pattern at work, I began seeing it at home, where the evidence was harder to explain away. At the office, I could call it leadership or responsibility. At home, it looked like checking my phone while Margaret was talking from another room. It looked like letting Laura, my daughter, go to voicemail because I wanted to finish one more message, then forgetting to call back until the next morning. It looked like sitting at dinner while part of my mind remained in a conference room that no longer existed. The clearest evidence was in the garage. One Saturday, I went out looking for a screwdriver and found my old workbench covered with dust, loose screws, sandpaper, and small unfinished things. Years earlier, that bench had been a place where I made things for no good reason, except that I liked the feel of wood in my hands. David, my son, used to sit on an upside-down bucket and hand me nails like he was helping with important construction. I remembered those afternoons only after seeing the bench again, and that bothered me. Work had blurred so many years together, while small family moments had been waiting quietly for me to notice what I had let go. On the back of the bench was a wooden airplane I had started for Evan, my grandson. One wing was rough, the tail still had pencil marks, and the body was clamped together as if it had been waiting for me to return from some short errand. I picked it up and felt a kind of embarrassment I could not blame on anyone else. No boss had stopped me from finishing it. No emergency had stolen that exact hour. I had simply ranked it lower every time work asked for something. Margaret came to the garage door and saw the airplane in my hand. She said she had forgotten about it, and I said I had too. Then she looked round at the tools and the wood scraps and said, "I used to like this." I said I still did, but the answer sounded weak even before she asked whether I really did. The truth was uncomfortable. I liked the idea that I still liked those things. I liked keeping old versions of myself nearby, the tools, the books, the walking shoes by the door, because they let me claim there was more to me than work. My actual days told a different story. That afternoon I tried to finish the airplane. I sanded one wing, then thought about Monday's meeting. I shaped the tail, then checked my phone. I reached for the glue, then felt guilty about an unanswered email. I was in the garage, but the office was still inside me. Later, Evan came over with Laura and found the airplane on the bench. When I told him it was for him, his face lit up as if I had built something extraordinary. instead of nearly forgetting something simple. He asked if we could paint it, and the old answer rose automatically. Next weekend. Instead, I said we could paint it after lunch. We painted the airplane blue at the kitchen table with newspaper underneath. Evan got paint on his fingers and a streak on his cheek. Laura laughed and took a picture. Margaret stood near the sink, watching quietly. For an hour, nobody needed me to approve anything or hold anything together. I was just a grandfather painting a crooked wooden airplane with a child who did not care what title I had ever held. That hour did not fix my life, but it reminded me that there was still a life there to return to. The airplane became more than a toy because it showed me the difference between intention and presence. I had intended to finish it. I had intended to be the grandfather who made small things with his hands and told stories while glue dried. I had intended to be the father who returned calls when he said he would, the husband who heard a full sentence without glancing at a screen, the man who still belonged to rooms where nobody needed a decision from him. Intentions had allowed me to feel decent without changing my behavior. That evening, after Evan went home with the blue airplane tucked under his arm, Margaret and I cleaned paint from the kitchen table. She did not say much, which made the room feel more honest. I wanted her to praise me for stopping long enough to paint with him, but some part of me knew how unfair that would have been. 1 hour of presence did not erase years of absence around the edges. Still, it mattered, not because it fixed the problem, but because it proved the problem was not permanent. I could choose differently at least once. That meant I could choose differently again. The next morning, Evan called to ask whether the airplane could fly. I told him it probably flew better in imagination than in the yard. He said imagination counted, and I believed him. The next Monday, I did not become a different man. I still opened email too early, still answered faster than necessary, and still walked into meetings with the old reflex to be useful before anyone asked. Change did not arrive as courage. It arrived as awareness, and awareness can be irritating before it becomes helpful. It sat in the background of ordinary moments and made the old answers harder to trust. That week, I noticed the language people used around me. They said they needed me, that I was the only one who understood a problem, that nobody else could handle a particular situation. Those words used to make me stand taller. Now they made me cautious, not because everyone meant harm. Some people were grateful, and some were simply overwhelmed. But gratitude can still become a leash when a person is hungry for it. On Thursday, I joined a meeting about a project that had already gone sideways. The invitation had said optional, which often means required if a person cares about reputation. For half an hour, people talked around the problem, softened it, renamed it, and moved it from one side of the table to the other. Then Richard asked if I could take ownership of the cleanup. A younger version of me would have accepted before the silence became uncomfortable. He would have gone home late and called it leadership. I almost did that again. Then I thought of the blue airplane drying on the counter and Evan's paint-streaked face. I thought about Frank's question and the silence that followed it. I said I could help define the cleanup, but I could not own the whole thing. The room went still in a way that told me how predictable I had become. Richard asked what I meant, and I said my current responsibilities already had deadlines attached. If this became mine, something else would need to move. My voice sounded calm, but my body did not believe it yet. I expected punishment, disappointment, or some permanent mark against me. Instead, Richard turned to another manager and asked what could be shifted. The conversation changed. Choices appeared where before there had only been assumption. That moment taught me something I did not enjoy learning. Some of the cage had been built by work, but much of it had been maintained by me. After the meeting, Tom, my longtime coworker, stopped by my office and said that was new for me. When I asked what he meant, he said I had not caught the falling knife. I laughed because the image was too accurate. For years, that had been my specialty. Catch the falling knife, hide the cut, then feel proud because the scar proved I was useful. That evening, I came home before dark. Margaret looked at the clock, then at me, and asked if everything was okay. The fact that my being home at a reasonable hour looked like a possible emergency told me more than I wanted to know. I told her everything was fine. I had just left. She smiled softly, and I could see that my choices had been costing more than time. They had been training home not to expect me fully. After dinner, I walked through the neighborhood. Garage doors were open, someone watered shrubs, and a child rode a bicycle in uneven circles at the end of a driveway. Ordinary life was happening without apology. I realized I had treated ordinary life like a reward I would earn after the work was finished. But work is never finished. It only changes shape. If I wanted a life outside the job, I would have to take it back before the perfect moment arrived. What surprised me after that meeting was how ordinary the consequences were. No one called me selfish. No one told me my career was over. The project did not collapse because I refused to carry all of it. A few people looked uncomfortable, then they adjusted. That was harder to accept than punishment. If the system could adjust that quickly, then how many burdens had I accepted simply because I had never let the room become uncomfortable? On the walk that evening, I thought about how often I had confused peace with danger. If my phone was quiet, I assumed I was missing something. If a weekend had no work in it, I felt guilty before I felt grateful. Work had trained me to distrust open space. Ordinary life had started to seem irresponsible unless it was squeezed between obligations. I did not know how to undo that in one decision, but I knew the first step was refusing to treat every empty hour as a vacancy work was allowed to occupy. The hardest part was not saying no once. It was learning to survive the feeling afterward. I had built so much of my confidence on being agreeable under pressure that even a reasonable boundary felt like a small betrayal. It took time to understand that disappointing an assumption is not the same as failing a person. Making room for life did not feel peaceful at first. I expected relief, as if leaving on time a few evenings would make me lighter. Instead, free time exposed how little I knew how to be free. A quiet evening felt pleasant for a short while, then uncomfortable. I would wander through the house looking for a task or check my phone without purpose, searching for some small problem that would let me become useful again. One night after dinner, Margaret found me standing in the kitchen scrolling through nothing. There was no urgent message and no reason to be holding the phone. It was simply the old motion of a man who did not know where to put himself when nobody was asking for anything. She watched me for a moment and said, I did not know what to do when no one needed me. I wanted to argue, but the sentence was too accurate. I set the phone down and admitted she was right. That admission was heavier than I expected. I had spent decades treating being needed as a close relative of being loved. At work, need came with urgency and clear instructions. At home, love was quieter. It did not always hand me a problem to solve. Sometimes it only asked me to sit still, listen, and be available without performing. I was not very good at that. A few days later, Laura came over alone and brought coffee. We sat on the porch in mild weather while a dog barked somewhere behind a fence. She asked how work was, and I almost gave the usual report. Busy, complicated, manageable. Then I stopped and told her I was trying to talk about work less. She smiled and said she had not asked because she wanted a report. She wanted to know how I was. That question embarrassed me because I did not have a clean answer. I looked at Laura, grown now with her own responsibilities, and wondered how many times she had come to me looking for a father and found a manager instead. Not an unkind man, and not absent in the obvious way, but filtered through productivity, fixing when she wanted listening, advising when she wanted company, half present, because some part of me was always preparing for the next demand. I told her I did not think I knew how I was. She said that sounded lonely, and it was. I had been surrounded by people for years, teams, clients, managers, family, neighbors. My calendar had been full and my phone had never stopped. But I had been lonely inside the identity because people mostly met the capable version of me, the dependable version, the man who could handle it. I had helped them do that by hiding every part of myself that might need something. After she left, I found an old photograph in a desk drawer. It showed David as a boy sitting on my shoulders at a park, both of us squinting in the sun. I looked younger, but what struck me was not age. I looked unguarded. I could not go back and become that man again, but I could stop bearing what remained of him under duties that never ended. I made a list that week: walks, woodworking, breakfast with Margaret, calling Laura without multitasking, teaching Evan how to sand a board, reading one book all the way through. Small things, yes, but small things are often where a person begins returning to himself. The list I made that week did not look impressive, and that was the point. I wrote it on a yellow legal pad because that was what I had used for years to plan meetings and solve problems. This time the headings were different. People I want to call, things I still enjoy, places I want to go, without turning the trip into a recovery period. The list was not long, but it felt strangely vulnerable. It is easier to write down goals that make you look ambitious than desires that reveal what you have neglected. Margaret found the list one morning and read it while standing at the counter. She did not tease me. She only tapped the line about breakfast together and asked whether Saturday would work. The simplicity of that question nearly embarrassed me. I had made closeness seem complicated because I kept trying to earn it through performance. She was reminding me that some parts of a life are entered by showing up, not by achieving something first. That was a harder lesson for me than any promotion had been. After that, Saturday breakfast became a small appointment I protected. Not every week and not perfectly, but often enough that it began to feel real. We would sit with coffee and toast, talking about ordinary things, and I slowly learned that ordinary conversation was not empty just because nobody needed me to solve anything. The realization that work had become my identity did not make me quit my job. I know a cleaner story might end with a man clearing out his desk, carrying a box through the lobby, and walking into sunlight. My life was not that cinematic. I still worked. Bills still came. People still needed decisions. The difference was that I stopped letting work answer every question about who I was. At first, the changes were ordinary enough to look unimpressive. I left on time twice a week, then 3 times. I stopped apologizing for having plans, even when the plans were only dinner, a walk, an hour in the garage, or nothing at all. Nothing became important because I had lived too long as if every empty space had to be filled by work. Some people adjusted quickly, others tested the old version of me, with late messages and urgent language for problems that could wait. I learned to hear the hook without biting every time. I still failed. Some days the old pride returned, and being needed felt better than being free. Some days I confused pressure with importance and almost felt grateful for the familiar weight. The difference was that I could see it happening. Awareness did not make me perfect. It made me responsible for the next choice. Months after the backyard conversation, I ran into Frank at the grocery store. He was standing near the tomatoes, giving them more attention than many executives give important decisions. We talked about weather and retirement and nothing much. Then he asked if I was still keeping up. I smiled because I remembered using that phrase as a hiding place. I told him I was trying not to. He laughed, but I meant it. I was trying not to keep up with every demand and every version of myself, built to impress people who only knew my title. That weekend, Evan came over again. The blue wooden airplane had dried with uneven paint and one wing slightly crooked. He loved it anyway. We took it outside, and he ran through the yard holding it above his head, making engine noises without any concern for craftsmanship. I sat on the porch with Margaret and watched him. She said I seemed different. I asked whether she meant better different or strange different, and she said I seemed more here. That was the best compliment I had received in years. Not impressive, not essential, just here. I think about that often now. I spent much of my life trying to become someone people could respect, while the people who loved me were mostly hoping I would become easier to reach. Titles are clean. Roles are clean. Performance can be measured. Real life is messier because it asks for presence without applause. If I could speak to my younger self, I would not tell him to stop working hard. Work mattered. Providing mattered. Responsibility mattered. I would tell him to be careful when admiration starts replacing intimacy. Be careful when being needed makes you feel more alive than being home. Be careful when you can describe your job in detail, but struggle to describe your own joy. Identity is not what you are paid to do. It is what remains when nobody is evaluating you. For a long time, I did not know what remained. The answer came back slowly, through a walk after dinner, a finished wooden airplane, a conversation where I listened more than I solved, and a quiet morning when I did not reach for my phone. Piece by piece, I became less impressive and more real. It sounds smaller than a title. It feels more like a life. I do not want to pretend the change was clean after that. There were still evenings when I answered the messages I should have left alone. There were still weeks when the old identity returned because it was familiar and rewarded. But after the backyard question, the office morning, the wooden airplane, and the meeting where I did not catch the falling knife, I could no longer claim I did not see the pattern. Seeing it did not make me finished. It made me accountable. That is what I would want someone younger to understand. A job can be honorable and still become too large. Responsibility can be real and still become a hiding place. The danger is not always hating your job. Sometimes the danger is being good at it, being praised for it, and slowly letting that praise replace the harder work of being known. I learned that late, but not too late, to come home differently. Now when I look back, I do not measure the change by one brave decision. I measure it by the number of evenings I did not give away, the calls I returned without multitasking, and the quiet hours that no longer felt like wasted time. That is where the real repair happened.